Hi guys, Buildzoid here. It's been a while since I made a video, hasn't it? So, in order to make sure that there is a video today, I am not going to stop this recording no matter what. Otherwise, this video isn't getting done today, and that would suck, I think, for everybody involved. But especially me, because that means I'd be reshooting this stupid thing way too many times. Anyway, today I wanted to talk about some basic things that basically, well, like if you are getting into DDR4 overclocking, you should know this because it will make your life a lot simpler and help you. And also, if you're just buying memory, this will also help you out because I've seen some pretty concerning misconceptions out in the wild, so to speak. Well, by which I mean the r/overclocking Discord, because I kind of stopped perusing the r/overclocking subreddit since man, that place is boring. Anyway, so the first thing you should know, there are three DDR4 memory chip makers. And the reason you should know this is because a lot of people, when they, first timers, they go shopping for RAM and they see names like Kingston and G-Skill and Crucial and Corsair and Team Group, and they have all these memory kits and they have all these different speeds and timing specs, and they're all made using the same chips. All of them, pretty much. And the reason for this is rather simple. There are three chip makers. There's Micron, there's Hynix, and there's Samsung. And Team Group, G-Skill, Crucial, Kingston, Corsair, AData, APacer, Galax, all of these various memory vendors, they go to Micron, Hynix, Samsung, buy a bunch of chips from them, bin them, test them, put them on memory sticks, program the SPD profiles, put them into packaging, and sell them. Okay, that's what you go buy in a store. Is basically if you buy like a G-Skill kit, it was binned by G-Skill. The PCB was designed by G-Skill. I'm not sure if G-Skill would actually manufacture the PCB themselves. I guess yes, because, well, I honestly don't know who handles the assembly and the, like, physical manufacturing aspect of that. But certainly, like, the binning would be, like, G-Skill doing that, as well as the programming of the SPDs. That would be G-Skill as well. Corsair, Kingston, Crucial, Team Group, all of these companies basically do the same thing. They buy a bunch of memory chips from Samsung, Hynix, or Micron, and then they make memory sticks with them and, sort out the specs for those memory sticks. Now, the reason why you need to be aware of this is that Samsung, Hynix, and Micron also have various die revisions, and that's what actually decides how your memory stick is going to overclock. So if you buy a kit of E-die, regardless if that E-die is made by Team Group or like is packaged, you should really call it packaging because they're not making the E-die. E-die is made by Samsung, and only Samsung. Okay, Samsung makes E-die. That's a 4 gigabit DDR4 memory chip. And if you buy an E-die kit from G-Skill, Team Group, Crucial, Kingston, Corsair, it'll always clock the same, okay? Well, okay, it won't always clock the same because obviously there's the silicon lottery, some binning, there's also the binning process that it goes through, and there's, the PCB does actually affect the memory overclocking capabilities. A badly designed PCB can cost you quite a few megahertz or a few ticks of your memory timing, so it can have some impact on the overclocking capabilities of the memory stick. What it won't really impact is things like, say, voltage tolerance. Okay? If you buy a memory stick with early Micron DDR4, and by early, I mean like from when X99 was relevant. When X99 first came out, the first DDR4 memory chips that Micron made were awful in the voltage department. These things would not work above 1.4 volts, by which I mean they wouldn't die. Okay, they wouldn't like break and stop working if you gave them more than 1.4 volts. But if you tried to run them on 1.4 volts, you would not have a good time because they would be impossible to stabilize. They would literally not run any tasks. They wouldn't finish any benchmarks because they wouldn't run stable at that much voltage. What they did do was, say, reasonably tight timings at, say, 2400 megahertz. So you could run something like 12, 11, 11 at 2400 megahertz on 1.3 volts, which is like, that's a significant improvement over, the stock profiles that these kinds of memory kits would come at. because normally those Micron chips would be found on like 2400 CL16 kits rated for 1.2 volts. If you just gave them 1.3, you could drop the timings through the floor. But they didn't, like, the frequency didn't tend to actually improve. You could maybe overclock them to like 2600 megahertz, CL13, 12, 13, 12, 12, and that was it. They like no amount of voltage, no amount of looser timings would make those memory kits go past 2600 megahertz because those memory chips were just not capable of doing that. If you looked at Hynix at the time, Hynix had MFR. MFR, would scale up to 1.65 volts, and if you went over that, it wouldn't work. And actually, there was some kits that would peak at like 1.55 volts. So you had this sort of 1.55 to 1.65 volt range where MFR would max out, and unless you put it on liquid nitrogen, any more voltage would just lead to instability. And it would max out around sort of 3000 to 3200 megahertz with CL9 to 10 and TRP and TRCD of around 14 plus minus 1. So, and all MFR behaved like this. Now, if you had a memory stick with a really badly screwed up PCB, yeah, it would probably clock like garbage. But if you had the best PCB and like a good PCB or even the best PCB and MFR, it would top out around 3200 megahertz, CL10, CL9, 3000, 3200, and that kind of cast latency. That's just how MFR behaves. And if you look at like the Samsung side of things, if you have something like B-die or E-die, well, let's talk E-die first. So E-die will typically do something like on 2 volts, you might do something like CL12, 4000 megahertz, but your TRCD and TRP are going to be 2020. Like they're going to be really high. So they'll be like 2020. I have a kit that needs 2121. And the reason for this is the TRCD on these sticks does not actually improve very much with voltage, if at all. It's basically like your TRCD and your TRP on those sticks will follow your frequency. So as your frequency goes up, your TRCD and TRP go with them, but as you crank up the voltage, they don't really improve. If you look at something like Hynix MFR doesn't have as high TRP and not MFR, AFR. AFR doesn't have as high TRP and TRCD. It scales all the way to 1.9 volts, but the cast latency doesn't go as low as on E-die, and the frequency doesn't go as high as on E-die. So these are like pretty distinct differences between the memory chips that like the memory vendors do not affect. Like if you buy an AFR kit from Kingston or you buy an AFR kit from G.Skill, it's still going to clock pretty much the same unless Kingston or G.Skill just completely botched the PCB layout. And if you buy B-die, it's all going to clock like B-die. So, there is the core behavior of the memory sticks is going to depend on the memory chip you have, and then the actual, the peak overclock will be slightly affected by the memory chip, by the memory vendor who actually designs the PCB and tacks on the heatsink, tacks on the RGB, and does the binning process, because the binning process is also actually something you need to consider. These companies, like the specs those kits are shipped at, that's what they're binned for. So if you're buying like if you get a Corsair kit of 3200 CL16 B-die, is probably the worst B-die on earth. And the reason for this is Corsair has a lot of different speed bins, and G.Skill does too, except G.Skill takes it to the extreme that instead of relegating their crappy B-die into the same category as like AFR, because AFR is really, really common on 3200 CL16 memory kits. Now, G.Skill's way of dealing with that is that they've made a B-die bin that's 3000 C14, which AFR can't do, but B-die does. So you have this really low-speed B-die memory kit, which is CL14 at 3000 megahertz, and it's the worst B-die that G.Skill basically comes across in their binning process. Now, Corsair, they don't have a 3200 CL14 and they don't have a 3000 CL14. They're like, where they put their B-die is 3200 CL16 with all the AFR. So if you end up with that, it's probably going to be the worst B-die on the planet, because Corsair also has B-die kits that are rated all the way up to 4600, and G.Skill has the same all the way to 4700 megahertz on G.Skill's side. So when you're buying these like bottom of the barrel kits, basically like the really low spec memory kits, there's a pretty good chance what you end up with is going to kind of suck. On the flip side, the binning process that the memory manufacturers use does not look into high voltage. Like if you're just benchmarking, they don't consider high voltage overclocking capabilities. So when you take one of those 3200 CL14 kits and shove 2 volts through it, you might find out it's actually pretty decent, or even really, really good, because the binning process never ever even it's never tested at 2 volts. It's tested at like 1.35 or 1.4, 1.45 or 1.5. Like some of the super high frequency kits we're seeing today, those ship at 1.5 volts. That's still not like the behavior at 1.5 volts could be very different to compared to behavior at 2 volts, because a lot of the time you'll find that some BDI kits will just stop scaling past 1.9 volts. So it'll look good until you're at like 3800 megahertz CL12 1.9 volts, and then you go to 1.95, nothing improves, and well, that's not great, is it? Whereas you have other kits where they look decent. You're at 1.9 volts, 3800 CL12, and then you go to 2 volts, and it does 4,000, it does 3,900 or even 4,000 CL12. So those, there is some chip-to-chip variance like that, and the binning process won't pick up everything. For this reason, actually, it was preferred when one of the preferred kits for like binning BDI from G.Skill was a 3600 CL15. Not actually the top speed bin that G.Skill makes, because the 3600 CL15 was a lot cheaper and had a very high probability of being good, because it was sort of like the 3200 CL14 at the time was G.Skill's worst, and at the time 4133 or like 4266 CL19 was the best G.Skill made, and these 3600 CL15 kits were just like this really nice balance where the binning process seemed to be putting quite a lot of actually really good memory kits for extreme overclocking into that 3600 CL15 category. So if you bought those, you had a pretty good chance of finding something that did 4000 CL12. And so those got kind of popular. But of course, as manufacturers add more SKUs and just decide to bin harder and harder, the likeliness that you're gonna find a gem in the junk pile is kind of can change over time. So that's kind of that. And ultimately, when you're so basically when you're buying your memory and when you're overclocking your memory, you need to consider what actual memory chips you have, not so much the brand and the stock spec of the memory kit itself, because you can find AFR, like good AFR chips on 2666 CL15 kits from Kingston, or at least you could in the past. I'm not sure what they put in them now, but in the past, those were AFR. And AFR, if you knew what you were doing with it on Z270, you could clock that stuff to 3733. Admittedly, not at timings as tight as E-die or B-die, but you could do it. So it was a very good sort of value option, because you could hit relatively high frequencies on a relatively affordable memory kit. And so yeah, that's kind of that kind of consideration there. If you bought microns, they just like, if you have a low frequency platform, like I really like running microns on X99, because not the super early ones, but some of the later microns, I have a micron kit that on around 1.4 volts will do like 2600 CL12. And in fact, I think I ran it daily at 2800 CL12 at 1.45 volts, and it doesn't go past 2800. And it scales up to like 1.7 volts, and at 1.7 volts you can do like 2800 CL9, but it doesn't go higher frequency because it's micron. There's not really much you can do about it. Those chips don't go high frequency no matter how loose you set the timings. I had it all the way to like 18, 18, 18, and it still wouldn't do 3000. So, depending on what kind of memory chips you have, that's what'll dictate the memory overclocking experience you'll have. Now then, another general misunderstanding I would like to clean up. There is a lot of people who don't understand how memory timings work. And basically, this is just, memory timings are a measure of how long some operation in your memory takes to do in clock cycles, not time. It's in clock cycles. So if you have a 2400 megahertz CL16 kit, that means the column access strobe is 16 ticks of that 2400 megahertz, which is actually not the 2400 clocks, it's a physical, so you're looking at 1200, at the 1200 megahertz real clock that the RAM is running at, because it's double data rate. So 2400 is effective data rate, real clock is 1200. So basically, if you want to know how long your memory stick is actually taking to do a column access strobe, you take 1 second, you divide it by, for this 2400 megahertz kit, you take your 1 second, you divide it by 1.2 gigahertz, because that's what it runs at, and then you multiply the output of that by 16, and that will give you your the amount of time a column access strobe latency in nanoseconds. It'll give you that time in nanoseconds. And that's the proper way to do the calculation. But quite frankly, it takes forever and not worth it, because a much easier way to gauge relative performance from memory kit to memory kit, like if you just, you're going through a store and you're sitting there and there's like a memory kit rated at 2400 CL12 and a memory kit rated at 3200 CL16, the easiest way to figure out which one of them has a lower latency is to take the clock speed divided by the timing. Okay, and whichever one of them ends up with the higher number is better. So if you take 3200 divided by 16, that's 200. If you take 2400 divided by 12, that's also 200. Both of these actually will have the same column access strobe latency. In which case, you should go buy the 3200 CL16 kit, because that 2400 CL12 kit is literally the same latency and much lower clock speed. So it's just straight up worse, because the only time you will start seeing a performance loss as you increase frequency is if your timings start getting extremely loose. Like if you were comparing the 2400 CL12 kit against a 3222 CL22. Nobody actually sells that, at least as far as I'm aware, but 3200 megahertz CL22 is JEDEC spec for 3200 megahertz, okay? Anything tighter than that is an XMP profile, but if you compare your 2412 versus 3222, there's a pretty good chance that on some platforms, in some tasks, that 2412 is probably going to just straight up outperform the 3222 kit, because the 3222 has a ridiculous amount of latency on the column access operator, like on the the CAS latency is ridiculous. So you need to consider your timings against the frequency. You can't just go and look and say, okay, this timing is very low, therefore this is a low latency memory kit. No, it's not. If the timing is low relative to the frequency it's at, then it's a low latency memory kit. Like, for example, a 3600 CL15 is really, really fast compared to a 2666 CL15, or a 3600 CL16 is really, really fast compared to a 2400 CL16. 2400 CL16, like that's a huge difference. But a 3600 CL16 is actually slightly higher latency than a 3200 CL14, but a CL15 would be lower latency than a 3600 CL15 would be lower latency than a 3200 CL14. And you can very easily gauge this by, again, you take the frequency divided by the clock cycles, whichever memory kit ends up with the higher number has the lower latency. Because the reason why that even works is because if your latency number gets bigger, then the output of that division will be lower. So, more latency, less performance, lower number, and more frequency, output of the division ends up being bigger, higher performance. Pretty simple. It's basically kind of a hack, because it's not based on anything real. It's not any kind of real metric, but it's a very quick way to gauge which memory kit has more or less latency. So if you're just buying by stock specs of a memory kit, this is what you would look at. Take your frequency and divide it by the timing. If the output of that is pretty similar, buy whichever kit has the higher frequency, or whichever is more affordable, unless there's some huge frequency difference, Like if you have a 3214 versus a 3616, there I'd argue it by whichever one is cheaper because they're probably both B die anyway, and you can probably overclock the 3200 into the 3616 anyway. But if you're comparing like say the 3222 versus the 2412, you'd probably be better served with the 2412 because that probably will overclock to 2613. And at that point, it's not even like that point is not going to be much of a discussion if that 2613 is better than the 3222, because you might be thinking, okay, the 3200 has to have more bandwidth than the 2400 megahertz kit, but this is not actually true because all your operations in your memory depend on timings. So one way to think about this is imagine if you have two people and you're sending them to fetch stuff from a warehouse, right? And one of them is extremely fast. Like they run really, really fast, but they're terrible at finding things, right? So you tell them to go find a box, and then you have another person who is just kind of okay at finding things, and mediocre, average at finding things, and average at running them. Okay, if you send that person who's super fast, like once they find the item and they can run out really quick, but they take a month to find the item, and then you compare them to the person who's just kind of decent at finding things and decently fast at bringing them back, you'll find out that basically they'll probably turn up at the same time, because one guy's going to spend the entire time searching, and then they're going to bring you the package really quick, but they spent so long searching they actually lose they can even lose the race. And that's why you can't just frequency alone doesn't indicate bandwidth. Now, generally speaking, higher frequency kits will have more performance, but if the timings are just completely atrocious, you will actually lose performance. And if you have a motherboard, which this is one of those things which comes down to the SPD, and the RAM manufacturers can affect this quite a bit. If the SPD programming on your memory stick doesn't play well with your motherboard, you can end up with your motherboard just putting in the stupidest values for your various subtimings. Like I had an example of this where the X370 Tai Chi, there was a BIOS update that introduced, basically there was a BIOS update for that board which started to the board would automatically configure a whole bunch of subtimings for you, and it would configure them badly. Really, really badly. Like, it was ridiculous because the end result was the board was setting all of your the board was setting up my subtimings for my memory kit so loose that it was slower than at 2133 megahertz because it did exactly what I just described. It set up the memory into a situation where the memory would search for stuff to bring you so long, because RAM doesn't actually spend that much time searching for things. It's there's a lot of other operations than just finding the thing you want to read. But anyway, the overly simplistic example aside, basically that board was setting all of the timings so loose that 2133 was faster because 2133 has standardized memory timings that have to work. Okay, that's JEDEC. You can't fail JEDEC. If your memory doesn't do JEDEC, then there's something fundamentally wrong with it. And so at 2133, that kit was doing better than with the auto timings from the motherboard, because the motherboard was just like, I don't know what this RAM is. I don't know what to do with it. Let's just slap the highest possible value for every single setting and pray that it boots, which it booted. It was just so incredibly slow. Like, it was losing performance in 3D Mark. It was losing performance in benchmarks. It was worse everywhere because the timings just got ridiculously loose. And this is basically one of the concerns with memory kits. If you just throw a lot of frequency at it, some motherboards will just not know what to do about it, and they'll throw your timings out the bloody window. And when they do that, you will actually start losing performance because, sure, you're now running at very high frequency, but you're spending most of that time doing operations that shouldn't be spending way too long doing things that shouldn't be taking that long if you just ran a lower frequency. So, timings and frequency they go hand in hand. You can't ignore one or the other. A low timing does not necessarily indicate a low latency, and a high frequency does not necessarily indicate a high bandwidth. They generally do, but you can't just go mindlessly accepting that, okay? And we'll go into more details about this in like another video, but this was basically just a primer to point out that, you know, how your RAM overclocks depends mostly on the memory chips you have. And then timings and frequency are like, they're, I guess you could say two sides of the same coin, maybe. But yeah, basically the point is that your timings and frequency are linked very, very closely. So you can't just ignore, like, you can't just ignore one or the other. So yeah, I think that should cover most of the, like, the absolute basics for RAM overclocking. Yeah. I think I made this excessively long, but I hope I at least drove the point home. Thank you for watching. Like, share, subscribe, leave a comment down below, or a complaint, because I'm not going to reshoot this anyway. And what else was it? If you'd like to support what I do here with actually hardcore overclocking, I have a PayPal, a Patreon, and there's also shirts. Also, I've finally listed the... Like, I'm dumping a getting rid of two motherboards, the X99 UD4P and the Asus B350 Prime Plus. Both of them are up on the junkyard, so if somebody wants a cheap motherboard, go check those out. One of them's X99, the other one's B350. I just want to get rid of them. The B350 has no chance of having a warranty. I've done quite a lot of, like, physical, like, there's Plastidip on it, and there's a voltage read point on the back of the CPU socket. Which actually, if you want any further modifications on that board, like ground lines and SOC voltage read points, I can add those. It's just, like, I've not been bothered. So if you want that board and you want any more modifications, you can just, you know, mention that in an email if you're interested. So yeah, you can go check all of that out and help out the channel that way. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.